I still remember the moment my daughter-in-law smiled at me across that crowded backyard and said sweetly, "I'm so glad you could make it, Eleanor." Because in that exact moment I had the strange feeling that the entire afternoon had already been carefully arranged long before I arrived. My name is Eleanor Hayes, I'm 68 years old, and I have attended more family reunions than I can count. But that Saturday in late June felt different the second I stepped out of my car. The reunion was being held at my son Michael's house just outside Dallas, a wide suburban home with a large yard and a wooden deck that overlooked a stretch of dry Texas grass. Cars were parked along both sides of the street, folding tables were lined up under white canopy tents, and the smell of barbecue drifted through the warm afternoon air. It looked exactly like the kind of family gathering that should make a mother proud. After all, I had raised Michael by myself after his father passed away nearly 20 years earlier, and seeing the family grow had always meant everything to me. Brittany, my daughter-in-law, was the one who had insisted on organizing the reunion this year. She had called everyone weeks in advance, telling them how important it was for the family to reconnect. At the time I thought it was thoughtful of her. Brittany had always been charming in that polished, effortless way that made people feel comfortable around her. She was the kind of woman who remembered everyone's favorite dessert, who laughed easily, who greeted relatives with warm hugs. At least that was the version of Brittany most people saw. As I walked toward the backyard gate, I noticed a few relatives glancing at me in a way that made me pause. It wasn't openly rude, nothing dramatic like that, but it felt as if quiet conversations had been interrupted when I approached. A couple of cousins nodded politely, though their smiles seemed tighter than usual. I brushed the feeling aside and told myself I was imagining things. Family gatherings can make anyone a little self-conscious, especially when you're the older generation surrounded by younger voices and louder laughter. Brittany met me near the deck steps wearing a pale blue summer dress and the same perfectly practiced smile. "Eleanor, you made it," she said warmly, giving me a quick hug. Her perfume smelled like fresh flowers, light and pleasant. "Of course I made it," I replied, trying to sound cheerful. "It's a family reunion." She laughed softly and gestured toward the tables where people were already filling their plates with brisket, potato salad, and cornbread. I scanned the yard looking for Michael. My son stood near the grill talking with his uncle, holding a paper plate in one hand. For a moment I felt that familiar swell of pride seeing the man he had become. But when he finally glanced in my direction, he looked away a little too quickly. It was a small thing, the kind of detail most people would miss, but a mother notices those things. I felt a faint knot tighten in my stomach. Brittany guided me toward a table at the far edge of the yard. "I saved you a seat," she said brightly. The chair she pointed to was tucked at the end of a table where a few distant relatives sat quietly sipping iced tea. From there I could see the entire gathering, but I was just far enough away to feel like an observer rather than part of the center. As I sat down, I noticed Brittany moving easily through the crowd, greeting people, laughing, whispering small comments here and there. Every so often someone would glance in my direction afterward. It was subtle, almost invisible, but after a few minutes the pattern became impossible to ignore. That was when the realization slowly began to settle over me like the heavy Texas heat. This reunion wasn't just a reunion. Brittany hadn't gathered the family here simply to celebrate. She had gathered them for a reason, and somehow, without quite knowing how yet, I had become the subject of the afternoon. I sat at the far end of the long folding table with a plastic cup of iced tea slowly warming in my hand, watching the reunion unfold like a scene I had somehow stepped outside of. Children ran across the yard chasing a bright red ball. Someone turned up the country music playing from a portable speaker, and the smell of smoked brisket drifted through the air. From a distance it looked like the perfect family gathering. The kind people post pictures of online with smiling captions about love and togetherness. But from where I was sitting, something underneath the cheerful noise felt slightly off, like a conversation happening just out of earshot. Every few minutes I noticed small glances in my direction. They were quick, almost polite, but they were there. My cousin Laura leaned toward her husband and whispered something while looking toward me. Across the yard, Michael's younger cousin Brian stopped mid-sentence when he noticed me watching. I told myself not to read too much into it, but after a while the pattern became impossible to ignore. Brittany moved easily between the tables with the confidence of someone hosting a perfectly planned event. She carried a large tray of lemonade glasses and laughed as she handed them out, her voice bright and friendly. People seemed comfortable around her, leaning closer when she spoke, listening carefully. A few times I saw her glance briefly in my direction before continuing her conversations. It was subtle, but the timing made my stomach tighten a little more each time. After a few minutes, my sister Carol joined me at the table. She sat down slowly and smoothed her napkin across her lap. Carol had always been honest to a fault, and she was not the kind of person who could easily hide discomfort. For a moment she simply looked out at the yard without saying anything. Then she gave me a small smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "How have you been, Eleanor?" she asked. "I have been fine," I replied, studying her expression carefully. "You sound surprised." She hesitated before answering, and that hesitation told me more than any words could have. "Well," she said quietly, "I guess I have just heard that things have been a little tense lately." I felt the knot in my stomach tighten another inch. "Tense?" I repeated calmly. Carol glanced toward Brittany, who was now standing near the grill speaking with Michael and two of his uncles. "Brittany mentioned that you and Michael have been having some disagreements," Carol said carefully. She seemed worried about him. For a moment I simply looked at her, trying to understand what exactly Brittany had been telling people. Michael and I had disagreed about small things before, the way families always do, but nothing serious enough to become the subject of whispered conversations at a reunion. "Did she say what those disagreements were about?" I asked. Carol shifted slightly in her chair. "Not exactly," she admitted. "Just that you have been putting a lot of pressure on him lately. She said he has been feeling caught in the middle." The word settled over me slowly. Pressure. Caught in the middle. They were vague enough to sound believable but serious enough to create doubt. It was a clever way to shape a story without needing to explain it fully. I looked back toward the center of the yard where Brittany now stood beside Michael with one hand resting lightly on his arm as she spoke to a group of relatives. She laughed at something someone said, her smile wide and warm, and for a moment she looked exactly like the gracious host everyone believed her to be. Then she turned slightly and her eyes met mine across the distance. The smile remained on her face, but something colder flickered behind it, something that lasted only a second before she turned back to the group. That was when I realized that whatever story had been quietly spreading through the family this afternoon had not started by accident. Brittany had been preparing this moment for a while, carefully placing pieces of a picture into other people's minds. And judging by the looks I had been receiving since I arrived, that picture was not very flattering to me. Carol's words stayed in my mind long after she stood up to refill her drink, leaving me alone again at the edge of the table. Pressure. That was the word Brittany had chosen. It sounded serious without sounding dramatic, the kind of word that could quietly shift how people saw a situation. I watched the family moving through the yard and slowly began to notice how carefully everything seemed arranged. The tables were positioned in a wide circle so that most conversations happened in the center, while the seat Brittany had saved for me remained on the outside of it all. From where I sat, I could hear the laughter but not always the full conversations. I had spent most of my life raising a son, running a household, and working long hours at a local insurance office, and those years had taught me something simple about people. When something feels staged, it usually is. A few minutes later, Michael finally walked toward my table carrying a plate of food. For a moment I felt relieved, thinking perhaps we would speak privately and clear up whatever confusion Brittany had been spreading. He sat down beside me but did not immediately look at me. Instead, he adjusted the napkin under his plate and stared down at the brisket as if it required his full attention. "Hello, Mom," he said quietly. "Hello, Michael," I replied. I waited for him to say something more, but the silence stretched between us like a thin wire pulled too tight. Finally, I asked the question that had been building in my mind since Carol's comment. "Your aunt just told me Brittany thinks I have been putting pressure on you," I said calmly. Michael shifted slightly in his chair. "She just means things have been stressful lately," he answered carefully. His voice sounded rehearsed, like someone repeating a line they had already practiced in their head. "Stressful in what way?" I asked. He hesitated before speaking again. "Brittany feels like you have been asking a lot from us recently. About the house. About the future." I studied his face, noticing the tension around his eyes. The house he was referring to was the small brick home I had lived in for nearly 30 years, the one his father and I bought when Michael was still in middle school. It was fully paid off, and after his father passed away it had become the one place that still felt steady in a world that had changed too quickly. I have not asked anything from you, I said quietly. In fact, the last conversation we had about the house was when Brittany suggested I might want to sell it. Michael looked uncomfortable. She was only thinking about what would be easiest for everyone long term, he said. I nodded slowly, though the explanation did not make much sense. Brittany had mentioned selling the house several times over the past year, usually framed as friendly advice. She talked about how large it was for one person, how much easier life could be in a smaller place. Each time I had simply told her I was not interested. The subject always seemed to return a few months later, as if the previous conversation had never happened. Before I could respond, Brittany's voice suddenly rose above the music from across the yard. Everyone, can I have your attention for a moment? She called brightly. Conversations around the tables began to quiet as people turned toward her. She stood near the center of the yard with one hand resting lightly on the back of Michael's empty chair. Her posture was confident, relaxed, the way someone stands when they know they have the room's attention. I just wanted to say how happy I am that the whole family could come together today, she said warmly. A few people nodded and smiled. Family is important, especially when things get complicated. Her eyes moved briefly in my direction before returning to the crowd. The words sounded harmless, but something about the way she said them made the air feel heavier. I sat very still as the quiet spread through the yard. Because in that moment I began to understand that Brittany was not just sharing polite remarks with the family. She was preparing them for a story. And judging by the careful looks people were already giving me, I had a strong feeling about who the main character of that story was going to be. The backyard grew quiet as Brittany stood in the center of the gathering with that calm, polished smile that had already convinced half the family she was simply being thoughtful. A few people lifted their cups of lemonade or iced tea and waited politely for whatever she wanted to say. Brittany rested both hands lightly on the back of a chair and looked around the circle of relatives as if she were about to give a warm welcome speech. I really mean it when I say how grateful I am that everyone came today, she began, her voice clear and friendly. Family does not get together often enough anymore. Several people nodded. Someone near the grill murmured agreement. Brittany paused just long enough to create a sense that something meaningful was about to follow. But I also believe family should be honest with each other, she continued. And sometimes honesty is not easy. I felt the weight of several curious glances settle in my direction before she even said another word. It was subtle, but the shift in attention was there. Brittany had already prepared the audience before she began the story. She sighed softly as if speaking about something that had been weighing on her for a long time. Michael and I have been dealing with some difficult conversations recently, she said. And I think it is only fair that the people who care about this family understand what has been happening. My hands remained folded calmly in my lap while I listened. I had no intention of interrupting her, because sometimes the most revealing thing a person can do is continue talking when they believe everyone believes them. Brittany glanced toward Michael, who stood a few steps away near the grill. He looked uncomfortable but did not say anything. She placed a gentle hand on his arm as if reassuring him. Michael has always tried to keep peace in this family, she said warmly. But lately he has been under a lot of pressure. Again that word appeared. Pressure. It floated across the yard like something carefully chosen in advance. Pressure about what? Uncle Robert asked from one of the tables. Brittany gave a small, reluctant smile as though she wished she did not have to explain. About decisions regarding Eleanor's house, she said softly. The moment my name entered the conversation, the quiet around the yard deepened. Brittany continued speaking with the calm confidence of someone who had rehearsed every line. Eleanor has mentioned several times that she expects Michael to take responsibility for the property soon, Brittany said. And that has been very difficult for him. I felt Carol turn slightly in her chair beside me, clearly trying to understand what Brittany was implying. Responsibility in what way? Someone else asked. Brittany sighed again, this time with a gentle shake of her head. Selling the house, managing the finances, making sure everything is arranged properly for the future, she explained. Michael already works very hard, and I hate seeing him feel like he is being pushed into decisions he is not ready for. A few relatives exchanged uncertain looks. None of what Brittany was saying sounded outrageous on the surface, which was exactly why it worked. She had chosen details that could easily sound believable without explaining the full picture. I noticed Michael staring down at the grass, his shoulders slightly tense. Whether he felt embarrassed or conflicted I could not yet tell. Brittany continued with the same careful tone. "I respect Eleanor very much," she added quickly. "She raised an incredible son. But sometimes expectations can become overwhelming." The words hung in the warm air while the family absorbed them. Several people now looked toward me openly, waiting to see how I would react. I could almost see the quiet question forming in their minds. Was there truth in what Brittany was saying, or was something missing from the story? I remained completely still because I knew something Brittany did not. When someone builds a story slowly in front of a crowd, the truth eventually finds its way into the room. And I had already prepared for the moment when that would happen. For a few seconds after Brittany finished speaking, the yard remained completely still. The music from the portable speaker continued quietly in the background, but no one seemed to notice it anymore. Every conversation had stopped. I could feel dozens of eyes moving between Brittany and me, waiting to see what would happen next. Brittany had done exactly what she intended to do. She had placed the story in the center of the gathering, and allowed everyone else to fill in the details on their own. That kind of storytelling was powerful because it did not sound like an accusation. It sounded like concern. Brittany looked around the group with a small, careful smile, as if she had simply shared something difficult but necessary. "I just think families should support each other," she added gently. "Michael and I love Eleanor, but lately things have been complicated." The way she said my name made it sound as though I were a problem that needed to be handled delicately. A few relatives nodded slowly, not because they were certain she was right but because they did not yet know what to believe. My sister Carol glanced toward me, clearly waiting for me to respond. Michael still stood near the grill with his hands in his pockets, staring down at the ground like someone hoping the moment would pass quickly. I took a slow breath and remained seated. I had learned many years ago that reacting too quickly often helps the person who is trying to provoke you. Brittany was watching me carefully now, her expression patient and calm. She expected one of two reactions. Either I would become defensive and confirm the image she had just painted, or I would remain silent and allow her version of events to settle comfortably in everyone's mind. What she did not expect was something in between. Uncle Robert cleared his throat and spoke first. "Eleanor, is that true?" he asked in a cautious voice. "Have you been asking Michael to take over the house?" The question was not hostile, but it carried the quiet curiosity of someone trying to understand a story that had suddenly become very public. I looked at Robert, then at the other faces around the yard. Some appeared concerned, others confused. No one looked angry. That told me something important. Brittany had planted the idea, but she had not yet fully convinced them. "No," I answered simply. My voice was calm and steady. A few people shifted in their seats. Brittany tilted her head slightly, as if she were surprised by the answer but not offended. "Eleanor," she said gently, "you mentioned it several times this year." "I remember you bringing it up," I replied, still seated, still composed. "Not me." The distinction seemed to ripple quietly through the group. Brittany's smile did not disappear, but it became a little tighter around the edges. "I only suggested it because I thought it would make life easier for you," she explained quickly. "The house is large and maintaining a property like that alone can be difficult." That part was technically true. The house was larger than most people expected for a woman living alone. It had 3 bedrooms, a wide front porch, and a backyard that stretched nearly half an acre. But the house was also mine, paid off after decades of careful budgeting and long hours of work. It held every memory of the life my husband and I had built together. "I appreciate the concern," I said evenly, "but that decision has never been Michael's responsibility." Brittany opened her mouth to reply, but I continued speaking before she could interrupt. "And I have certainly never asked him to sell the house or manage anything for me." The quiet deepened again as the family absorbed the difference between what Brittany had suggested and what I had just said. For the first time since she began speaking, Brittany seemed slightly unsure of how to proceed. She glanced briefly toward Michael, perhaps expecting him to confirm her version of events. But Michael still had not looked up. That was when I slowly reached down beside my chair and lifted the small leather handbag I had brought with me that afternoon. I placed it carefully on the table in front of me while the family watched in silence, because there was something Brittany had not realized when she decided to turn this reunion into a performance. She believed she was the only one who had prepared for this moment. I could feel the attention of the entire yard shifting toward the small handbag resting on the table in front of me. It was nothing special, just a simple brown leather bag I had owned for years, the kind most people would never notice twice. But at that moment it might as well have been the center of the afternoon. Brittany watched me carefully now, her pleasant expression still in place but no longer quite as relaxed as it had been a few minutes earlier. When someone believes they are controlling the story, the smallest unexpected movement can change the atmosphere completely. I rested my hand lightly on the bag and looked around at the faces gathered in the warm Texas sunlight. Some relatives leaned forward slightly, curious about what I might say next. Others simply waited, unsure whether the conversation had reached its end or was only beginning. I think there may have been some confusion about how this situation actually started, I said calmly. My voice remained steady, the same tone I had used for years when explaining complicated insurance policies to frustrated clients. Calm explanations have a way of slowing down a room. Brittany folded her arms gently across her waist, still smiling in that careful way. There is no confusion, Eleanor, she said softly. I only wanted everyone to understand why Michael has been feeling stressed. Her words sounded reasonable again, but I noticed something small that most people would miss. She had stopped looking directly at me. Instead, her eyes moved briefly toward the handbag before returning to the group. That tiny shift told me she had begun to wonder what might be inside. You are right about one thing, I said. The house has been discussed several times this year. A few relatives nodded as if that part matched what they had heard earlier. But the idea of selling it did not begin with me. I slowly opened the clasp of the handbag and reached inside. The movement was deliberate but unhurried, the kind of motion that allows a room full of people to focus completely without feeling rushed. From inside the bag I removed a thin envelope and placed it on the table beside my glass of iced tea. The paper looked ordinary, but the moment it appeared, several heads tilted slightly closer. Brittany's smile faded just enough that the change became visible. What is that? She asked lightly. Just something I kept after one of our conversations, I replied. I slid a few printed pages from the envelope and set them neatly on the table. The breeze from the open yard lifted one corner of the paper before it settled again. Uncle Robert leaned forward slightly from his seat. Emails, he asked. Text messages, I answered. The words moved quietly through the group like a ripple. Brittany straightened a little where she stood. I do not see why private messages need to be shared with everyone, she said quickly, the first hint of tension entering her voice. I looked up at her with the same calm expression I had worn since the beginning of the conversation. Normally I would agree with you, I said. But when a private conversation becomes the center of a public discussion, it is only fair that the full context is understood. Several relatives exchanged glances. The idea made sense, and that was the advantage of patience. When someone rushes to control the narrative, they often forget that facts have their own quiet power. I picked up the first page and held it where the people nearest the table could see. This message is from Brittany, I said. Sent to me in February. Brittany shifted her weight slightly, the confident posture she had held earlier beginning to loosen. Michael finally lifted his head and looked toward the papers on the table. The yard had grown so quiet that even the music from the speaker sounded distant. I began to read slowly, clearly enough for everyone gathered around to hear every word. Because the message described something Brittany had not mentioned in her speech. It described the first time she suggested that selling my house might be the best solution for everyone involved. The quiet in the yard felt heavier now. The kind of silence that only happens when people realize a story may not be as simple as it first sounded. I held the printed page steady in my hand and read slowly so that every word could be heard clearly. Brittany wrote, Eleanor, I have been thinking about something that could really help everyone. That house is worth a lot now, especially with the way property prices have gone up around Dallas. If you sold it, you could move somewhere smaller in Michael, and I could help manage the process for you. I lowered the page slightly and looked up. Several relatives were listening closely now, their attention moving between Brittany and the paper in my hand. What I had just read did not sound cruel or aggressive. In fact, it sounded helpful on the surface. That was the clever part. Brittany had always been careful with her words. She rarely said anything that could be clearly criticized, but when you read several messages together, a pattern slowly appeared. I lifted the second page and continued. 2 weeks later she wrote again. Eleanor, have you given any more thought to the house? The market is really strong right now. Michael could take care of everything for you and it would take a lot of stress off your shoulders. A few people shifted slightly in their chairs. The tone of the message still sounded polite, but now they could hear the repetition. I glanced toward Brittany. Her arms were no longer folded comfortably at her waist. Instead her hands rested stiffly against the back of the chair beside her. I answered her the same way every time, I said calmly. I told her I appreciated the concern, but I was not interested in selling. I lifted another sheet from the stack. Then in April she wrote this. I read the words clearly so that there would be no misunderstanding. Eleanor, you may not realize how much responsibility the house will eventually place on Michael. If it were sold now, the money could help him and Brittany build a stronger future. That sentence moved quietly through the group like a change in temperature. For the first time people began to hear something slightly different in the message. It was no longer simply advice about maintenance or convenience. It was about the money that would come from the sale. Uncle Robert leaned forward with his elbows on the table. Did you ask Michael to do any of this? He asked. No, I answered simply. I held up another page so the people closest could see the date printed at the top. And this message was sent the day after I said no again. I read the final line slowly. Eleanor, I really think you should reconsider. Michael feels uncomfortable bringing it up, but the house is something that affects both of us now. I lowered the paper and let the quiet settle again. Michael had finally looked up, and his expression was no longer distant. He stared at the pages in my hand as if seeing something for the first time. Brittany opened her mouth to respond, but for a moment no words came out. The confident tone she had used earlier had faded slightly. Those messages were only suggestions, she said finally, her voice a little sharper than before. I was trying to help. I nodded slowly. That may be true, I said. But earlier you told everyone that I had been pushing Michael about selling the house. I placed the stack of pages back on the table where everyone could see them. And these messages show that the conversation began in a very different way. The shift in the room was almost visible now. People were no longer looking at me with quiet suspicion. Instead their attention had moved toward Brittany, waiting to hear how she would explain the difference between the story she had just told and the messages sitting on the table in front of me. The silence that followed my last words felt very different from the silence earlier in the afternoon. Before, people had been quietly watching me with uncertainty, trying to decide whether Brittany's story might be true. Now their attention had shifted. The questions in their eyes were no longer directed toward me. They were directed toward Brittany. I could see it in the way several relatives leaned back slightly in their chairs, studying her expression as if they were trying to understand something that suddenly did not fit together anymore. Brittany straightened her shoulders and forced a small laugh that sounded a little too quick. Those messages do not mean what you are suggesting, she said, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. I was only trying to look out for the future. Her voice still carried confidence, but the smooth rhythm she had used earlier was gone. When people speak without preparation, their sentences tend to change direction halfway through. Uncle Robert folded his arms and looked from Brittany to the papers on the table. No one is saying you cannot make a suggestion, he said slowly. But you told us Eleanor was the one pushing Michael about selling the house. Brittany's eyes flickered briefly toward Michael, as if hoping he might step in and smooth the situation over. For a moment he said nothing. He was still looking at the printed messages resting on the table. I had known my son his entire life, and I recognized the expression on his face now. It was the look he wore when he realized something important had been kept from him. Michael, Brittany said gently, touching his arm again. You know how stressful these conversations have been. Michael did not immediately respond. Instead he picked up one of the pages and read the lines silently for several seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before but much clearer. You told me Mom kept bringing this up, he said. Brittany's smile faltered slightly. Well, she did not exactly bring it up directly, she replied. But it was obvious the house was becoming a problem. Carol leaned forward at the table beside me. Becoming a problem for who? She asked. The question hung in the air for a moment. Brittany hesitated before answering, and that hesitation said more than any explanation could have. For everyone, she said finally. I watched the faces around the yard as the pieces of the conversation slowly rearranged themselves in their minds. People were remembering Brittany's earlier speech, comparing it with the messages sitting on the table, and beginning to notice the gap between them. The shift was quiet but unmistakable. Earlier Brittany had spoken as if she were revealing a difficult truth about me. Now she sounded like someone trying to explain why the truth did not look the way she expected it to. Michael placed the paper back down and looked directly at Brittany for the first time since the conversation had begun. Why did you tell everyone Mom was pressuring me? He asked. The directness of the question seemed to surprise her. She opened her mouth, closed it again, and then glanced quickly around the yard as if searching for support among the relatives who had been nodding earlier. But the expressions she found were no longer so certain. I remained seated quietly, my hands folded in my lap again. I had no need to interrupt. When people begin asking the right questions on their own, the truth has already started doing its work. Brittany took a slow breath and tried to recover the calm tone she had used earlier. I just thought the family should understand what has been happening, she said. But the explanation sounded weaker now, like a story that had lost its foundation. Because once the first part of a narrative begins to unravel, it becomes much harder to keep the rest of it standing. For several long seconds no one spoke. The late afternoon sun hung low over the backyard, casting long shadows across the grass and the folding tables, but the warmth of the day no longer seemed to reach the center of the gathering. The attention of the entire family rested on Brittany and Michael, and for the first time since the reunion began, Brittany did not appear certain of what to say next. Michael stood very still beside the table, his eyes moving once more over the printed messages before slowly lifting to meet mine. I could see the realization settling into his expression, not all at once but piece by piece, like someone finally hearing a conversation clearly after listening through a wall for too long. Mom never asked me to sell the house, he said quietly, though his voice carried across the yard in the silence. It was not a dramatic statement, but the simplicity of it seemed to shift the atmosphere completely. Several relatives exchanged glances. Uncle Robert leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath. Carol rested her hand lightly against the table, as if steadying herself while she processed what had just unfolded. Brittany tried once more to recover the tone she had used earlier, but now it sounded strained. Michael, I was only thinking about what would be best for our future, she said, her voice softer but no longer confident. That house represents a lot of value, and I thought it might help us all if Eleanor considered the bigger picture. Michael looked at her for a moment before answering. That is not what you told everyone today, he replied. The directness of his words left very little room for interpretation. Brittany glanced around the yard again, but the expressions she met were thoughtful rather than supportive. The story she had carefully arranged earlier had lost its balance now that the missing pieces had been placed on the table. I slowly gathered the printed pages and slipped them back into the envelope. I did not raise my voice or continue arguing, because there was nothing left to argue about. The truth had already made its way through the room. I did not bring these messages here to embarrass anyone, I said calmly as I placed the envelope back inside my handbag. I brought them because when a story is shared publicly, the facts deserve the same space. No one interrupted. Even the music from the speaker had faded into the background of the moment. Michael ran his hand slowly across the back of his neck, a gesture I had seen since he was a teenager whenever he realized he had misunderstood something important. Mom, he said quietly, I should have talked to you about this sooner. I offered him a small steady smile. Families misunderstand each other sometimes, I replied. What matters is whether we listen when the truth appears. Brittany remained standing beside the chair, her earlier composure replaced with a silence that seemed heavier than anything said aloud. I did not look at her with anger. At my age I had learned that anger rarely teaches people anything. Instead I stood from the table, feeling the familiar Texas breeze move gently across the yard. "I think the reunion should continue," I said to the family around me. "That is why everyone came here today." A few relatives nodded slowly, grateful for the chance to let the tension ease. Conversations began again in quieter tones as people returned to their plates of food and glasses of lemonade. I lifted my handbag from the table and stepped away from the chair where I had been sitting since the afternoon began. As I walked toward the edge of the yard, I felt something lighter than when I arrived. Not because I had won an argument, but because the truth had spoken clearly enough on its own. And sometimes that is the most powerful response a person can offer.